Hi everyone, welcome. I'm preparing to check in on my newest worm bin, which is sitting right up here. The bin that's right next to it is just a pre-built bin. It's just waiting to be occupied by some wormies. So my newest stuff is usually over here to the right. But before we check in on this now 10-day-old bin of red wigglers to give them their first feeding, I wanted to also go over and take a look at the material that I got these worms out of. Because the material was very, very damp, and for that reason we placed it into this bag. This is a Vermibag tote, and the thinking here was that maybe if the material were a little bit more dry, then we'd have a batch of worms in here that are a little bit more motivated to move out of the material that they're in. So I've actually been back in here one time since our last check-in 10 days ago when we put this material in here just to stir it all up. I had waited 6 days, so 4 days ago I was in here stirring the stuff around, trying to aerate it a little bit, maybe help it dry. And if nothing else, all we're going to do is maybe just aerate it, inspect it how the material's coming along, and then we'll get over to feeding the new system. So I'm going to put on a glove. We'll get this one up on the bench first, and we're going to get started. Like we do sometimes, we sort of polled the audience in the video from the last time we checked in here when we hauled out the worms and launched off the new container. But since there was a pretty good view of how many worms were living in this stuff, I started getting various feedback from different people on how many worms they thought were in this stuff too, which I didn't really make a record of because I wasn't really prepared to start tallying up the number of worms in this material here. Although perhaps at some point when we do the final haul out, maybe I can actually turn back to those estimates to see how they fare against what people think when we actually do the official haul out. I just figured maybe I would pull out some of these little bits of shrapnel and debris, little bits of paper and cardboard, because technically this should be nothing but worm castings. So now the stuff out on the surface, definitely getting dry. It's just been sitting here exposed to the air, and I would think that anything that's a little bit lower should be still holding its moisture pretty nicely. But it also seems like maybe it's an opportunity to perhaps break the material apart a little bit into smaller chunks. Whenever the stuff is still too damp, it feels like it's going to hold together. And when it's finally at that point where it's not too damp anymore, it feels like it's going to break apart a little bit more readily. So it does feel like each handful should probably get sort of semi-processed a little bit, as long as I'm handling it anyway, to try to break up bigger clumps if possible. It would be kind of nice if I were to break one apart and they were to like really fall apart into little tiny bits. Some of them are doing that, as you can see, but some of them still feel like they want to hold together and be muddy. So whatever, I wasn't really expecting miracles here. The material just held out so long, being way too wet for the longest time. But luckily we were able to accomplish a pretty decent haul out last time. But obviously still a good number of worms remain in this stuff, as does a good bit of moisture still. So I don't really intend to spend a great deal of time in here. Just seems like if we can kind of work our way through the material, looking for any sort of really large clumps that we should try to break apart a little bit, possibly stirring in some of these drier materials that have been out on the surface now for the past 10 days. Well, actually for the past 4 days now, right? Because 6 days after we last checked in here together, I did do a good stirring of the material, so that was 4 days ago. So maybe that's just something I should do a little bit more regularly, you know, come back every couple days and give it a stir. Just so that anything that's down low, still hanging on to its moisture, maybe bring it to the surface where it might have a chance to release some of its excess moisture. It is kind of nice how the material is starting to flow a little bit better. Alright, so just using this as an opportunity to pull out any other little bits of debris we encounter along the way. But I'm not looking for more input on how many worms people think live in this stuff here, so don't contribute your estimates at this point in time, please. I will at some point do a roundup of these worms somehow. Not sure how that'll be managed quite yet, but it'll be at that time that we're going to try to size up how many worms we managed to haul out of this material. And at that point, it would be nice if it was a you know, a 100% evacuation, a complete depopulation of the material. Perhaps it is a good segue into us putting this back up on the shelf and letting it continue. Hopefully by stirring things around a little bit, we've managed to incorporate some of the drier stuff that was out on the surface and mix it in with some of the more damp stuff that was hiding out down below, possibly further helping the material to equalize in its moisture content. But I think we're going to get the new bin out here so that we can give them their first feeding. Here and there I just bump into certain things that seem like they're just scraps of bedding, which we can just drop into the new system, but other things are little bits of plastic or whatever. Not sure how they end up in the material, but it's as good an opportunity to remove it. Even here, a little piece of avocado skin. Here too, a little piece of cardboard. Those are the sort of things we could simply drop right into the new worm bin. So let's get that out here next and get them fed. Okay, so now the estimated population so far, and I mean there's still a possibility that some other people are going to still watch the launch video, the video of when this system was launched 10 days ago, and possibly still kick in some additional estimates. But you know what I normally do, for those of you that are unfamiliar, is that I take all the estimates that the viewers provide in the comments and then I average those values together. So I'll always use that averaged value as the official count of how many worms occupy a system. And right now, like I said, I'm still going to wait until we get a few more numbers from the viewers. But so far, the rough estimate, I would say, I don't have the exact number on the tip of my tongue, but I believe so far we're hovering somewhere around an estimate of about 2,600 worms are thought to live in here. That was just based on the observation of the worms as they were getting hauled out of their old environment, out of the horizontal migration feeding zone, and placed into here. So now let's see. We do have what appears to be some interesting. These are actually bits and pieces of the stuff that had been in the horizontal migration feeding zone, stuff that was just taking forever and wasn't really showing many signs of breaking down. It's stuff that I suspected was not breaking down because it had been possibly placed into the worm bin without first being frozen. And these are little Brussels sprouts, and some of them look like they're sprouting. I got little sprouts coming out, like 5 different sprouts on this piece here, 3 of them on this piece. These are just leaves not trying to grow, but here too, another chunk that's attempting to grow. So it's, I guess, one of those types of materials that's very persistent and wants to keep trying to grow. And I think worms are the type of creature that's not going to try to feed on something that's actively attempting to grow and is still alive. They're going to usually nibble on stuff that's already dead and decomposing. So I got a feeling that these pieces of leftover Brussels sprout are just going to take a little bit longer before they finally break down here in the worm bin, just because they're not completely demised. So what do we have here? This might just be some more material that would have came over with the worms from their old environment. So whatever, I'm just going to throw that stuff in the corner. We'll try to drop it down in the feeding area when we're done here. This would be some of the nice bedding material that the system was built with. And a lot of times when you bump into a lot of castings like we're seeing here out on the surface, you think to yourself, wow, we got an active bin, lots of worms cruising the surface and leaving their castings behind. But I think in a brand new system like this, that's probably really just leftover material from what had been hauled out of the old system and was part of their horizontal migration feeding zone, which included leftovers and some uneaten bedding and a whole bunch of castings too. So pretty sure that a good part of what we're seeing here is not castings that were just produced here within this system, but rather material that just came over with the worms when they got dropped in here. So now I got some other stuff that we collected out of the finished castings too. Maybe we'll just use this as a little opportunity to explore how things are looking throughout the bin, maybe turn up some of the material on the outer edges to make sure the moisture level's holding out pretty good everywhere. It sure seems that way. Everything seems pretty cozy and comfortable. I do see worms hanging out here and there within the material. Let's see. Not bad, not bad. Sometimes in the summertime, it's now, you know, only a day or two from the official launch of summer, or the start of summer. I guess the unofficial launch of summer is Memorial Day, which is already a couple weeks ago. So as the summer months roll in, the humidity in my area tends to run pretty high, and I don't run climate control in my house in the summer, really. On really extreme days, I'll turn on the air conditioning, but normally I'll just, you know, try to conserve energy and not really use air conditioning too much unless it's really, really unbearably hot and humid and nasty. So yeah, that humidity in the air, it tends to prevent the worm bins from losing their moisture to evaporation. So the worm bins do tend to stay nice and damp, the way the worms like it. Sometimes even too damp, so much so that the material gets all clumpy and nasty, just like it was in the material that I pulled these worms from. And that's, in my book, that's just unmanageable. They're very difficult to deal with, so I don't consider that as the ideal situation. I'd really much rather have material that's nice and flowing and crumbly and loose. And in a system like this that's still only 10 days old, it's still primarily bedding materials. That's pretty much what we've got, which is nice. See, I figured we would probably hit little pockets of material that was just a little bit more damp than others, and that's where the worms are going to be camped out. It seems like that's what we're bumping into now. There's a little havens of moisture, little pockets of slightly more dampness that the worms are really gravitating towards. No feedings though. I mean, I put these worms into this material and gave them nothing to eat so far. Although, you know, if you think about it, all their bedding is fair game to be food. And since my bedding is also made up of leaves, in a way you can really just consider the leaves that get used as my bedding also sort of register as a viable food source for the worms. So it's not like they're starving or anything. But today we're going to get them on the normal regimen of being fed my kitchen scraps. It's not only my kitchen scraps, but it's kitchen scraps that I bring home from my mom's house. And even yesterday I brought home some stuff, so the majority of what we're seeing in here is from her house, except for that banana peel. That's the banana that I ate yesterday. There was a part of the banana that didn't seem too good, so I kind of left that for the worms as well. So here and there we're bumping into little pockets of higher moisture content and sort of encountering little worm balls in those areas. Here's another one, it seems. And maybe once we give them this first feeding and those foods that are in here begin kicking off some of their moisture content, like that watermelon right there, some of this peel of a pear, even this chunk chunk of perhaps cauliflower stem. All those things, since they've been frozen, will start to emit moisture as they thaw, possibly also leading to a little section of the bin that's going to draw the worms to itself. So let's oh, here again, another little pocket of worms hanging out in a batch of material that's just a little bit more damp than the rest. So, oh, there we go, a little bit more. So I feel kind of bad disturbing them and ripping apart that little pocket of moisture that they were really enjoying there. But I really wanted to see how things are looking in this relatively new bin. As you can see, as I'm digging this trench down the middle, now that I've also aerated the entire contents of this container, we're definitely approaching what seems to be the limit of this container as far as the rim. I'm almost at the rim here in most of it, except where I'm digging this trench. So I'm reluctant to add a whole lot more bedding. The system certainly doesn't need it. But what I thought I might do is use up some of the napkins that I brought home from my mom's house yesterday and kind of include the food in little bundles of napkin. And I mean, even that newspaper that was draped out across the top seems like it could potentially be usable as bedding down in the feeding area. But you know, I'm going to see what I could do about draping that out and continuing on with it for one more round. It was pretty shredded in certain places, but it does seem like we might be able to get one more use out of it before replacing it. So I think with that, we're going to see about just draping it back out over the top here when we're done. And now we can start placing in some of their foods. So that's the pear. And this, like, to me, looks like more of the same. Yeah, you can see the stuff's been out of the freezer now for a short while and starting to get a little bit gooey and thawing, which is, I guess, good, because that's going to allow me to wipe some of these castings off my glove and return it back out into the worm bin rather than having it just get flushed down the sink when I rinse off my glove. So now here's perhaps the one object in the collection that's probably not going to release too much moisture, is the stem of a head of cauliflower. Got two more of these, so why don't we just give them all four of them. I got a feeling by being surrounded by all these yummy foods, these napkins are probably going to get pretty beaten up. Partially eaten up and very beaten up. So yeah, see, there was something weird about this banana. I tried to nibble around the parts that didn't seem too bad, but a good bit of it just didn't seem very good. It was all tough and weird, so I decided it was going to turn into worm food. And here's the last of the ornate napkins that I bought home from my mom's house yesterday. And into that we could place this delicious watermelon chunk and what remains of these additional pieces of pear. It's really just the peels of pears, it seems, and that seems like a pretty generous feeding. When I first brought it down here, it didn't seem like all that much, but just based on its weight, it's definitely got some good weight to it. I'm going to sprinkle some of my grit onto this food as well, because when I build a fresh bin with just bedding and stuff, it doesn't get any grit. So this grit is really the only game in town. So when the worms come for the food, they'll be able to grab some of that grit, and they'll ingest that along with their foods, and it'll sit down in their gizzard and it'll work as sort of a helper medium or helper material down in the worm's gizzard so that they can break down the foods that they ingest. And now all that remains is getting everything covered up and leveled off, and that'll be our check-in. As far as that material that the worms originally came out of, what we looked at in the beginning, I think it still could stand to dry off a little bit more. And once it does, I think the worms in that stuff will be pretty highly motivated to get out of it and come over to some sort of a feeding zone or collection area, maybe a bait box or something. I haven't really decided how I'm going to work on rounding up those worms out of that container yet. But I still want to see some further drying of the material before I attempt that again. So that'll just continue on that way for a little while. But then I'll revisit it at some point in the near future. So here we go. My top covering is sort of all over the place. Perhaps we can just consider it as more of a feeding zone indicator. Or maybe double as both. Alright, so back on with the plastic covering. Kind of makes me wonder if it's even all that important. As you can see, it does have some pretty large gaps around both edges, permitting a good bit of airflow. And the material over there on those sides will get pretty dry as well, which is fine. I'm not going to worry too much about it. Maybe later we'll give them a somewhat larger covering, covers up more of it. Maybe something that actually ventilates, like a large piece of cardboard. But for now, I think we're in good shape with what we've got here. So that's it for our check-in with our now 10-day-old batch of red wiggler worms getting their first feeding, and I guess pretty good size feeding too. Maybe we can wait another 10 or 12 days before we check back in. Alright everyone, that's it for the video. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. Alright everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.